Hello and welcome to the Somerset Archaeological and Natural History Society's talk about timber framing. My name's Lizzie Induni and I'm a trustee for SANHS and also chair of the Historic Building Committee. Today we're going to hear a talk about timber framing by Joe Thompson. Joe's been a carpenter working with historic timber frame buildings for the last 33 years. As well as conserving and building new timber frames, he teaches these skills to students at the Wealden Downland Museum and West Dean College in Sussex. He also provides interpretive reports on standing timber frames in order to understand their form, development and significance. His research revolves around the materials, tools and techniques used in timber framing from the 12th to the 19th century. This afternoon's talk will introduce us to some of the mysteries of the craft and things to look out for when looking at historic timber frames. In today's lecture, to make things simple, Joe will take questions at the end of the talk. To ask questions, you'll need to activate the chat button at the bottom of the page and type in a question. To find the button, just run your mouse over the bottom of your screen and a series of buttons should pop up. If the button's not there, it might be at the top right or even hidden under 3 dots. Because we're going to be recording this lecture, we won't be mentioning names in the question time, and this is for reasons of privacy. It's free to register for the talks, but a donation of £4 towards the ongoing costs of SANHS would be gratefully appreciated. The donations button is on the SANHS website donations page. When donating, please label your donation timber. You can do this under a small tab labelled Add Note. To make things easier, a link to the donations page will also be posted in the chat button at the end of the lecture. So, over to Joe.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. I'm going to share my screen. Where's it gone? Wrong one. Try again. Bear with me. Nearly there. Lovely. Can you see that?
Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Joe Thompson. I'm a timber frame carpenter, and I'm going to talk to you about some of the mysteries of the crafts. These are some of the insights that timber frame builders have into how we successfully go about the transformation of turning trees into useful structures. I mentioned in the title box frame buildings. Now I'm aware some of you are in what we might call cruck country. So I'm showing here a picture of a box frame, which is the predominant form in the southeast of England. And in fact, in Sussex, Kent and East Anglia, we don't have any cruck frames at all. So it is the timber framing system. So there are 3 stages of carpentry, or I'd like to break carpentry down into 3 stages today. The first stage is related to the conversion of trees into timbers. The second stage then takes those timbers and the carpenter prefabricates them into frames. Then that kit of parts is taken to site and the timbers are reared up to form the structure. So starting at stage 1, the conversion of mainly local, mainly oak trees into timber. Oak, certainly in Sussex, is known as the Sussex weed. It's so common. And of course, the vast majority of timber frame buildings that survive are oak, but we shouldn't be blinded to the fact that other species almost certainly were used, although they're rather underrepresented in the surviving buildings today. So we do find some elm, occasionally internally a bit of ash. Obviously softwood came along, imported softwood later on, but we should be aware that other species are used, but I do tend to refer to oak an awful lot. So what sort of oak trees were the carpenters looking for? Well, tempting as it is when you see one of these trees and think, gosh, what a lot of timber there. It nearly always is the case that we don't find that timber frame buildings were built out of the structure anyway, out of trees like this. There's just far too much effort in knocking one of those over. We may occasionally have used something like that for an exceptional building, such as a windmill or something like that, where a particularly large size was used. But generally, we keep walking if we were looking for an oak tree. We wouldn't choosing that one. And by and large, for the sort of common or garden vernacular buildings, most carpenters wouldn't have access to these sort of park oaks either. Again, they're rather large, and we just don't need timbers of that size for the buildings. So where are the trees coming from that make the timbers for timber frame vernacular buildings? Well, they tend to come from places like this, the hedgerows, where we have rather smaller diameter, 200 to 400 millimeters. That's 8 inches to 16 inches in imperial. And it may be they're rather more closely grown in a woodland. So they tend to grow up rather tall and straight. And of course, down here in the southeast, we also have a lot of copse. So we have these oak standards growing with typically hazel underwood, which forces the oak trees up before they start branching. And the nature of these oak trees is that they're rather long, they're slightly crooked, and they're often not completely circular in cross section. That means when we chop them up into usable lengths before we convert them into rectangles, we find that you can see there they've got this oval cross section, they're rather crooked, and that means that when we do, nowadays we use a mobile bandsaw, but historically we would have used axes and saws, we tend to get sections of timber that retain in places the bark. You can see the lighter coloured sapwood, which is non-durable, and then you have the heartwood, and the rectangular section tends to come out of the oval much easier than a square section. So the vast majority of timbers you'll see in a timber frame building are of rectangular cross section. And we mustn't forget there's an awful large amount of cleft material used in a timber frame building. So not only have you got all the various posts and sills and wall plates, etc., but you've got the infill panels, such as the wattles and the staves going in between the panels, and also roofing material. We have shingles, certainly more documentary evidence than surviving, but we'd certainly still use shingles for our church spires today. Cleft material tends to be in relatively short lengths. We don't tend to find cleft material used for the structural members. But of course, the primary purpose of the woodlands was not for timber, was not for cleaving materials, it was for firewood. And this tended to come in the form of faggots, which is in the top of the picture there, bound up into a bundle, and then what we call billets, these split pieces of timber around about 3 to 4 foot long, in a sort of very handy transportable size for going off to market. So firewood was the predominant resource that was coming out of the woodlands, and building timber and cleft material was an added bonus. So to summarize all of that up, certainly what I'm seeing when I'm looking at timber frame buildings in this part of the world is relatively small diameter trees. So as I say, about 8 inches, 200 millimeters to 400 millimeters, 16 inches in diameter, thrown over using a crosscut saw and or a felling axe. So very simple tools there. Hewn up into timbers using again the felling axe and then a broad axe, and hardly ever with an adze. I know a lot of the books talk about using adzes, but the actual physical evidence remaining on the surfaces of the timber doesn't support this interpretation. Then we may split the timber into smaller pieces, and we often do that using a frame or an open saw, and that can be done on trestles, or it can be done over a pit, and we're splitting the timber, or sawing the timber, I should say, into 2 or 4 timbers generally. Sometimes more, sometimes we go for 8 pieces, but generally it's relatively small fractions that we're cutting into. Then we have the cleft timber, which we've seen for shingles and for the staves and for the laths, and that's for the roofing, the daubing, the tiling and the thatching. So that's the timber, that's the resource that the carpenter is using, what we call the carpenter's stuff. And I'd now like to move on to stage 2, prefabricating. And this is where we turn those timbers into the frames that the carpenter is going to be assembling one by one. So the carpenter needs a bag of tricks, if you like, ways of dealing with this heavy, wet and crooked material that he has. So let's start with the carpenter's tools. And I've split the carpenter's tools into 4 categories. The first one is the tools that he uses to line out the joints and to check the joints with, the lining and the checking tools. The second is the layout tools, those tools used to help position and orientate timbers. The third one's to do what we sort of think of as the main essence of the carpenter, that the cutting tools. And then we have the rearing tools to help put the frame up. So what are the lining and checking tools? Well, right at the top of the screen there, you can see a straight edge. That's a timber straight edge. This is one that's copied off a find from the Mary Rose. The Mary Rose was the Henry VIII's warship that sank in 1546 off Portsmouth. And because the contents of the boat were in a relatively low oxygen environment under the water, most of the wooden implements survived in very good condition, which is in great contrast to what we find in above water archaeological finds. So normally we find a lot of metal implements and very few wooden ones. Here we have the opposite. So the timber rule is based on a 16th century carpenter's rule, 2 foot long, divided off into various increments. We then have the carpenter's square on the left-hand side, and underneath that we have the scratch tool or prick knife used for scratching the lines and pricking out the various intersection points that we're concerned with. Next to that is the race knife. Then we have 3 pairs of dividers or compasses. And a carpenter can almost not have enough pairs of compasses. They're very useful for setting out dimensions, for transferring dimensions, for joining, thinking about how we're going to join one timber to the other. So tend to use those in preference to actually thinking in terms of millimeters or inches or fractions of inches. We just take the compasses to the width of the particular timber, and that's the width of that timber. And it's noticeable that the Carpenter's Company, their shield, and again that of the Mason's Company, have as their insignia 3 pairs of compasses and a square. So showing the fundamental nature of these tools to help turn what's in the carpenter's mind into something tangible onto the surface of the timber. Now the layout tools, remember we've got heavy timbers here. They're unsquare, so we have a selection of things like crowbars to help lift them up, the maul or the beetle, that large hammer in which we can knock them into shape. We have string lines with which we can impose straight lines over and on the surface of the timber. We have just above the handle of the maul there, we'll have something called a plumb rule. This is like the medieval equivalent of the spirit level. It measures true vertical. So you can put the plumb rule against the surface of the timber, and then using the wedges, you can tap the wedges in and orientate the surface of the timber into a vertical position. And then the metal tool at the top left is something called a hook pin or a draft nail, which is a way that the mortise and tenon joint can be temporarily held together, and then you can put the crowbar or under the hook there or knock it out, so you can then disassemble the frame. So it's an essential part of the prefabrication process. I mentioned measuring in the vertical plane. The A-frame level there at the bottom of the picture shows how we can measure horizontal. This is a tool that goes back to the Egyptians at least, and you can see there's another plumb bob hanging down from the center, and when it intersects the midpoint of that the bar of the letter A, then you know that you've got a horizontal. And above that we have 2 pieces of timber that are 10 foot long, and they are the 10-foot rule. We have a wonderful book published in the late 1600s by Joseph Moxon, the Mechanick Exercises, or the Doctrine of Handiworks, and this is essentially the first DIY manual. And in this book, we find reference to the 10-foot rod being used to measure out the plot. So it's curious that although we're an imperial country, which is often based in base 12, 12 inches to a foot, here we are using a decimal base 10 to measure out the feet of the plot. So it just shows how multilingual carpenters are. What about the cutting tools? Well, these, if you like, to say what most people think of when they think about carpenter's tools. And on the top of the picture, I have a replica medieval saw, sometimes known as a sword or bread knife type saw. These are the ones we see in the illustrations from the 15th and 16th centuries. They actually work very well, but they were superseded certainly by the 18th century by the closed handle saw that we all know today. Underneath that, I have a variety of axes. You have the felling axe with the longer handle, the hatchet, next one with the shorter handle, and then a version of a broad axe with the medium length handle on there. The felling axe is for roughing, squaring the timber up into a rough shape. The side axe or broad axe for smoothing it off. The hatchet is useful for chopping wedges and chopping the ends of tenons, etc. Then on the left-hand side, we have a variety of drilling tools. We have what's known as a wimble, or like a gimlet for drilling small holes for nails. We have a gouge, and the gouge there is essential for starting or picking out the holes for the auger, because the auger didn't start having a thread on the end, generally for these larger augers, until about 1800. So the majority of these holes we find in timber frame buildings, the holes were started with a gouge, and then the auger took over once it could bite its way into the timber. Then you'll see the homemade carpenter's mallet. Then underneath that, a version of a brace and bit, again for drilling small holes for nails. Then the chisels, and you'll see there's one chisel, about 1/2 inch, 12 millimeters in width. That's the mortise chisel. And then I have another chisel, which I call the tenon chisel. And you can, if you've got good eyesight, just about make out the maker's insignia there. It's a pair of cross pipes, and it's upside down, but it says WB. That's for William Beale, a blacksmith from Tenterton who was working in the late 1700s. Then we have the sharpening stone on the right-hand side, and we have that T-shaped tool, which is known as a twibill. And this was a tool used up to about 1600 by carpenters for chopping out mortises. It was swung like a pickaxe. And carpenters in this religious age, as it was then, would claim some sort of protection from the devil, because allegedly it was a tool he was rather afraid to use, because if he picked it up and accidentally scratched his forehead with one end, he would make a vertical line, and then if he happened to be a bit careless and scratch his head with the other end of the tool, he would make the sign of the cross on his forehead and disappear into a pile of dust. So the carpenters felt they had some sort of insurance policy against malign spirits when using that tool. And then for the rearing tools, we typically block and tackle and large crowbars for lifting these heavy timbers, getting some mechanical advantage so we can lift them up into the air. So what about the joints between the timbers? Well, it's a fairly simple classification, really. The main one is the mortise and tenon. These are the joints that we find typically in timber frame buildings, and they're used mainly in compression, or where things have been pushed together, or in shear, where timbers are tending to slide across each other. So here, which is which? Well, this is the mortise. And you can see in timber frame buildings that we're not like furniture makers or cabinet makers. We're not afraid to leave our construction lines extending past the joint. In fact, it's an essential part of the craft, because the sort of timber we're using, this wet timber, often with knots in and with splits and not being completely straight grained, it's small bits of timber do and can break out. So if you haven't got those long construction lines, you can be in the dark as to where you actually are meant to be cutting. So on historic frames, time and time again, we see these long scratch lines. And here's the tenon, and you can just about make out at the shoulder of the tenon, there's the evidence, the whipness mark for a saw where it is cut down at the neck of the tenon there. And then either using the tenon chisel and the mallet or a hatchet, one can shape out, you can split or cleave along the grain to shape the tenon, and then again use the chisel or the hatchet to smooth that timber off. And then you can see right at the very head of the tenon there, we give it a little chamfer, just so that when the tenon goes into the mortise, you don't get a little fibre sort of catching and trying to sort of interfere with the smooth fitting of the joint. That's the tenon. The old name for the tenon was a tenant, as it occupied the mortise. So if you're trying to remember which is which, the mortise is the hole, the tenon or the tenant is the tongue of timber that occupies the hole. And here is the joint assembled, and you can see those construction lines, how the construction lines at the bottom pretty much line up, but there's a slight offset between the construction lines at the top, and that's deliberate. We leave a small gap or crafty tolerance in between the tenon and the mortise at the top, because these are wet timbers and they're guaranteed to move and to distort as they dry, and we have to allow for that. And when we look at historic timber frames, we see that there's again a nice crafty gap between the mortise and the tenon there, and you can get, as Mr. Moxon, who I referred to earlier, the author of Mechanick Exercises, he talks about the thickness of an old penny being about the tolerance one would put in there. And we have the mortise and we have the tenon, and nearly always they're secured with an oak framing pin. And so we drill a pinhole that goes through the mortise. We then make a little mark on the tenon. You can just see the tenon entered into the mortise there. We make a little mark on the tenon. We withdraw or partially withdraw the tenon, offset the hole to be drilled slightly nearer to the shoulder of the tenon. We drill the tenon and then put the tenon back in, and so we have an offset between the hole in the tenon and the hole in the mortise, and this is called draw boring. And if you remember, you saw the hook pin or draft nail earlier on, and that was a tapered shape, and the reason it's tapered is because it goes through the mortise, goes through the tenon, and then goes through the other side of the mortise and pulls the assembled joint tight up so that the shoulder of the joint is doing the work. Lap joints often used for tensile connections. So what do I mean by that? Things that are being pulled apart. So typically where we have a tie beam, which is the timber at the top here, and where we have a wall plate, which is a timber that the tie beam rests upon, when we open that joint up, you'll see that the tie beam has the what we call a wedge or a dovetail shaped joint cut into its underneath, and the wall plate has the mirror image shape cut out of the top. And the more that the rafters push on the wall plate and try and thrust the wall plate out, the more that the dovetail or wedge shaped joint on the tie beam bites into the surface of the wall plate and helps hold it all together. So a nice simple mechanical joint there. And then we have what I call the butt joint. In Sussex, we have a lot of hipped roofs. This is where the roof at the end of the building is also inclined rather than a gable roof. And so this is a hip rafter in the middle of the picture, and you have what we call these shorter jack rafters, which are cut and fit onto the hip. And the connection between the jack rafters, the little short ones, is that they're nailed onto the sides of the hip. So they're not the only nail joints we get in the frame, but that's predominantly where we find them. And I call those the butt joint. And of course, we have also scarf joints, which are used to join two timbers end to end. And they come in a variety of forms. We have the splayed scarf joint. Here's a new version. We have the halved lap joint. You can see here we have a tongue or a tenon on the end of the two various parts and a halving through the middle. And we have the framing pins at each end going through those tenons. But you also notice going vertically through the scarf joint there, we have some square pegs in a round hole, and they're traditionally known as trenails. So a square peg in a round hole is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, in the carpenter's lexicon, it's a very good thing, because they are literally timber nails or tree nails. They are fastening the two parts of the joint together. So I would assemble this joint initially by putting the timbers together. I would drive the framing pins in. That's the pin at the extreme left and the extreme right. I would drive them into draw bore to pull the joint up tight. Then I would drill get my auger out and drill a hole, 4 holes, in fact, from the top right the way through the scarf joint. And as soon as I drilled the first one, I would hammer my first trenail in, and then I'd work my way through, and that would securely hold that timber together, that scarf joint together. You can also find mortise and tenon versions of the scarf joint, and we tend to find these in the sole plates and sometimes in the wall plates of timber frame building, where they're fairly well supported. It's not such an inherently strong joint as the half joint or the splayed joint that you saw earlier. So how can we combine the material that we're seeing, these oak trees, typically oak trees that we've cut down and we've hewn up and we've sawn up into our carpenter stuff, and then we've got our carpenter's tools, our lining tools, our cutting tools, our layout tools, etc. How can we combine that to make a timber frame building? Well, the first trick up the carpenter's sleeve is the trick of prefabrication. And this is the opposite of what you might say a bricklayer or a mason does. They start at the footing of a building, and they gradually start placing their stones and their bricks, and they just keep on going up and up and up. There's no prefabrication there. It is just an assembly on site. They're building on site. The carpenters do it different. We can either be working on site or we can be working off site in a framing yard. And Westminster Hall, for example, that fantastic roof built in the 1390s was made in Farnham in Surrey, and then it was floated in barges down the River Thames down to Westminster. So prefabrication allows you to do off-site preparatory work. And what we do is we join the timbers into a frame, and then we take that frame apart, and some of those timbers are then joined into a series of other frames. So we produce a kit of parts. Some timbers are in one frame, some timbers are in 2 frames. So in practice, here's a building which in fact is at Kew Gardens in London. It's up in the wildlife area. It's used as a nature resource classroom. And you can see here, I've got the sole plates at the bottom, nearest the left-hand side. I've got the wall plates on the at the top. And in between, I have the various wall timbers and braces. Now, the timbers at the bottom, the sole plates, are also going to be used in another frame. The wall plates are going to be used in the roof frame. And the corner posts, for example, are going to be used in the end frames as well. So some of those timbers are going to be in 2 frames. But things like the various braces, studs, rails, they're only found in this one frame. So in order to make sure that the timbers that are used in 2 different frames are in the correct orientation, not only for their individual frames, but for when the 2 frames come together, the carpenter makes something called a plumb mark, or a plumb and level mark, or a rotation mark. There's all sorts of different names. And one of the patterns that the carpenters make to denote this important reference mark is an arrow. Sometimes it's a St Andrew's cross, sometimes it's just 3 parallel lines. But if you imagine these illiterate carpenters, this essentially was a symbol for them. This was saying, place your plumb rule, place your square here, and use this to reference your frames. Here's a historic example from about 1600 in Sussex. You can see the broad arrow, and then on the left-hand side, we have something we're going to mention in a minute, which is our carpenter's assembly number. But the placing of these plumb marks, we think they were placed by the carpenter the first time they came into contact with the timber. By deduction, we can work out a sequence of frames, because these mysteries that I'm telling you about weren't written down by carpenters. Most of the carpenters were illiterate, And even if they could write, they probably wouldn't want to give away the secrets of their trade. And so we have to don our sort of detective hat to work out how they might have done it, as so little has been written down. But it looks as though certainly in the southeast here, that the first frames that the carpenters would do would be the plan frames. These would be the sole plates, the wall, then we would do the wall plate frame with its. So you've got the sole plate frame would be the first frame to be done. That gives you, if you like, the plan view, the length and the span. Then we'd lay on the wall plates and tie beams to get everything ready for the roof. And then we could actually lay the rafters out. Then we would take all those timbers away and lay out the side frames. And then we would take all those timbers away and lastly do the cross frames. So that's one sequence of frames that probably, from all the evidence so far seen, explains how most of the timber frames in this part of the world were put together. Now, occasionally when you're making your two-dimensional frames, there's a timber which is orientated such that it would be going vertically up into the sky or vertically down into the ground. And so you can't temporarily hold it in that position. And so the carpenter allows for that by making what he calls an offset datum. So this is a little bit like a signpost that is made at one stage of the prefabrication, which he then refers to at a later stage. So that symbol there is, we find it as a line. Here we've got two semicircles. It could be a whole circle. It could be a series of semicircles. There's a variety of different forms it appears in. It's a symbol that tells the carpenter, place your 2-foot rule on this line. And you'll see here, we have the dividers. Just underneath the point of the dividers, you have a version of the 2-foot mark. Here you have it with 4 semicircles above a line. And then the compasses are measuring the amount of timber still to be cut off. And the end of the 2-foot rule is telling us where to measure from. So it's an offset datum, and it's something that we see on an awful lot of frames, and it underlies the fact that they were prefabricating the frames. And another crucial part of the prefabrication process is the carpenter's assembly numbers. You can see here we've got a vertical number 1 cut across the grain. And the reason we number the joints, and I think this example shows it very clearly, is that each profile or shape of each of the timbers is unique. And so each of the shoulders of the tenon is perfectly cut or scribed, as we say, to fit against the surface of that other irregular timber. And so once we've cut that joint perfectly to fit very nicely or scribed it, we then number it so that we know that joint goes into that tenon, goes into that mortise. So the carpenter's assembly number is an essential part of the prefabrication process. And here's a historic example to show you that carpenters have always had to be, this one from about 1600, always been working with timbers that haven't always been straight. So how does all this come into practice? Well, I'm going to show you now some photographs of a 3-bay threshing barn built about 20 years ago using tools and techniques based on local Sussex examples. So here is the carpenter's stuff. You can see these are the various sole plates, wall plates, tie beams, and you can see a healthy amount of bark and sapwood on that timber, reflecting that it's come from small diameter trees, reflecting that traditional custom. Here is the framing ground. Essentially, it's blocks of wood, and the string line stretched between stakes banged into the ground is giving me not only a straight line, but also it's the start of a level plane as well. So I can use that string line to set out both a level plane, like a grid system that I can align my timbers to. So I've said that we start with a plan frame. So let's have a look at the first one. Here are the sole plates. And this being a threshing barn, you can see that there is a gap in the middle. So we have 3 bays. We have the end bay, then we have the threshing bay, and then the bay nearest us with the 2 wheelbarrow wheels in. That's a homemade trolley for moving these timbers about in with, is the 3rd bay. So we've got the 3 bays for the sole plates, so they've been mortised and tenon together. And typically you'll see that the sole plates going across the building tend to be tenoned into the side plates. So that's the way we tend to see it down here. There's no advantage of doing it like that. It's just the way it tends to be done. Then on top of that sole plate frame, I've laid out the wall plates and the tie beams. And you can see that the timbers, certainly for the wall plate directly in front of us, are not a dead straight timber, but we've got the various curvature of those growing oak trees reflected in the beams. And the carpenter has to have techniques that work around these imperfections. And by doing the scribing process, we can account for that. And that's why we number each of the joints, because all of the spans of the tie beams will be slightly different. So there's our second plan frame. And here's our third plan frame, which is the rafters that are being laid out using the tie beam wall plates as a jig from which to set out the rafters. Then we'll take all of those timbers away and I will set out the side frames. And so this is one side of the barn. This, in fact, is the front elevation of the barn. And this is the second time you've seen the sole plate. It's the second time you've seen the wall plate, but it's the first time you've seen those 4 jowl posts. And if you look carefully at the jowl posts, you can see there's an area where that's reflecting the light in a lighter pattern, and that's where the plumb mark is. You can see each of those posts, just where the jowl starts, has got above it a lighter area, and that's the plumb mark. So each of those posts has a plumb mark cut into the top surface so that I can orientate the timber and wedge it up to get it in just the orientation that I require. So the first time you've seen the jowl post, second time you've seen the sill, second time you've seen the wall plates. Then we lay on the girts, timbers in the middle, then the various studs and braces and lintels under the doorway there. And you can see the odd hook pin, I think, banged into some of the joints holding them together, the use of string lines. And here is the other side frame. This is the other side of the barn. And a lot of the threshing barns in this part of the world have a high pair of doors on the front elevation and a smaller pair of doors on the rear elevation. And you can see that reflected here. And in the threshing bay, the middle of the 3 bays, there is a lintel is slightly lower down. And you can see at the bottom of that one of the hook pins, and in the near corner on the right-hand side as well, hook pins holding those mortise and tenon joints together. So I can pull the joints up tight in prefabrication, but I can release the hook pins to help me get the frame apart. And I say goodbye to the side frames and hello to the cross frames. And this is the cross frame at the end of the one end of the barn. And this is the second time you've seen the sill going across the end of the barn. And it's the second time you've seen the jowl post. And it's the second time you've seen the tie beam. So I'm starting to draw all of my timbers together, starting to cut the last of the joints now. And there I've got my various studs and girts and braces and rafters, etc. And here is an internal cross frame by the threshing bay. And you can see that laid out there, and the crowbar useful for moving the big timbers apart. And here we have the completed kit of parts. So if you remember, we started off with that timbers laid out in that same area, but there wasn't a single joint cut in the timber. There wasn't a single assembly number marked on the timber. And here we have every single timber has been handled at least once. Every single timber is numbered. Every single timber that's used in more than one frame has got its plumb mark and possibly got its 2-foot mark, depending on where we find it in the frame. So, stage 3, rearing the timbers. We need to get the timbers to site. This is the modern way of doing it. The lorry with the high-ab crane. The old-fashioned way, of course, was the wagon, and a load of timber was the squared timber was 40 cubic feet. So this barn like this may be, I'm guessing, about sort of 6, 7, 8 loads. I'll have to do the calculations. So maybe 8 wagon loads, something like that, to get the timber to site. Then we lift the timbers piece by piece. And I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, well, I've seen that film, The Witness, and they get everybody together and they lift all their timbers up. They assemble them on the ground and lift them all up in one go. And that undoubtedly was the way that things like crucks were done in the west and the north of the country. But as far as box frames go, by and large, most of them were assembled piece by piece. So here we have the end of the barn, the first timbers to go down with the sole plates. Then I put those 3 studs up in the air, and I put that horizontal girt mid-rail running through, and then I put the corner post up, and the corner post locked onto the girt or the mid-rail, and that helped to, with a hook pin in the joint there, helped to hold it, and then I could use guy ropes to hold that up. And then using the modern version of the block and tackle, which is a chain hoist, I can then start to lift the rest of the timbers in, and you can see them slowly going up. And in fact, you can see very clearly the plumb mark on that one of those jowl posts there, shining, reflecting in the sunlight. Gradually, the frame goes up, putting up the side purlins on their collars there with their principal rafters, and then filling in the rest of the rafters with the hipped end on the left-hand side. It used to have, well, I say used to, this is a replica barn. The original barn was lost sadly during the Second World War by a stray bomb. The original barn had been built as a 3-bay barn, and then in about the late 1500s, and then in around about 1700, an extension on a masonry base had been built at the right-hand end, and they changed the hipped end to a gabled end there. So that's why you've got a gabled end at the right-hand end. And here we are looking at some of the internal cross frames, and then onto the end cross frame. And here we are with the barn restored, if you like, to its 18th century and after form. So we've got the later extension there done in a later carpentry style with the more simpler stud framing, and then little half hip, which is the more common roof terminal at that period. The wattling is starting to go in. The barn doors have been put on, and this barn, built in the late 1500s, reflects the local practice where we're transitioning from using wattle and daub into having boarded walls. And in this case, the evidence was from local barns that survived in the same parish that the walls below the girts were boarded at this period, and the walls above the girts still retained wattle and daub. So this one is a sort of in that transition, going from the fully wattle and daub to the fully boarded barn. And then you can see there that you've got the feather edge boarding on the 18th century, but you've got these rather wide flush boards on the 16th century replica. And there it is with the, after it's weathered in for a few years, with the wattle and daub applied. So to sum up, the key points, the timbers that the carpenters used are mainly used wet, and we call this sort of wet oak. If we're using oak, we call it green oak, green as in alive, rather than obviously the color green. It's that much moisture in it. It's as though it's still alive. Simple hand tools made by the local blacksmith and by the carpenter himself, by and large. And the building is prefabricated in a series of frames or layups. So you've seen that sequence of frames, the plan frames, the side frames, the cross frames. And in order to make sure that these various frames fit together correctly, the carpenter has a series of reference marks, clever little tricks, if you like, datums, references, so that we can align the timbers correctly. And we make sure that it's the shoulders of the joints that are tight. So in the mortise and tenon joint, it's the shoulders that fit tightly against the faces of the mortise, and we use our hook pins or draw bore pins to pull everything up nice and tight. And we take them away and we fit our oak framing pin when we're completely happy. And that pulls everything up nice and tight, because that transfers the loads to the ground. And because every individual joint is numbered, because every joint is unique, because all of the timbers are a slightly different shape, a slightly different size. And generally, it's reared piece by piece rather than as a frame. It's not that you couldn't rear it as a frame, but there's no need to when you can do it piece by piece. It's been designed to be done like that. So that is a good an introduction. I hope I haven't simplified it too much. I hope I've given you the essence of the journey that you take from the tree, the growing tree, turning that into a timber, turning those timbers into frames, and then turning those frames into a fully three-dimensional building. So hopefully next time you go into a timber frame building, have a look for the carpenter's marks. If you're lucky, you may be able to see some of those plumb marks on the tops of tie beams or on the tops of sills, on the outsides of posts, especially if you've got an aisle building. And you can just start to think about, how did the carpenter go about building this? And what can we say about the trees? What size of trees? What sort of quality of trees? What sort of grade of trees might have been used? And it will just start off a train of thought, and who knows where it will go. Thank you very much.
Hi, Joe. That was brilliant, most enjoyable and very interesting too. I noticed we have a few questions coming through on the chat, so anybody wants to ask any questions, do dive in, because I'll be able to interpret those back to Joe. In the meantime, while we wait for people to put their questions in, I know a few people have been very interested to know if you can recommend any books, particularly the one you were mentioning about Joseph Moxon. Can you get replicas of it?
You can.
Ah.
So this one was printed by the Astragal press, but there may be other reprints. Absolutely, yeah, wonderful book. Originally published in pamphlet form, and then they've been the reprinters taken them all and put them all together. He covers not only carpentry but joinery, and also blacksmithing and bricklaying, and wood turning. So it's a comprehensive introduction to 17th century working practices, but he has taken the illustrations by and large from a French publication earlier on in the 17th century. So this idea of cut and paste is nothing new.
That's fantastic. Is it vastly expensive? Because I know sometimes books can be.
I don't think it's too bad. And I think as I'm speaking to you, I remember that there was another version of this came out, I think, on Lost Arts Press, and again in the United States. So it is a classic book, and I think you won't have any trouble tracking it down. Of course, I have to recommend Richard Harris's book, Discovering Timber Frame Buildings. So still an absolute classic and the best introduction. And there's no better place to start than figure 1 in his, oops, the camera, it's back to front. It shows the deconstruction of a timber frame, three-dimensional building into its various constituent frames. So Richard has completely started the reader off right at the right place in way of thinking about turning, the carpenter's looking at 2 dimensions, but all the time thinking in 3 dimensions.
Absolutely brilliant. That's really helpful, Joe. We've got lots of questions coming in now. In my mind, I've always got sort of an idea that when people were growing trees, that they did it quite specifically for buildings. Now, you seem to think that really they were growing just firewood. But in my head, maybe completely wrong in this, if you're trying to build a crook frame building, would they have kind of organize their trees to grow in a certain way, for example, in a curve?
It's a big question, so I'll try and just pick away at it. In terms of crux, I don't think you have any problem growing trees to the shape of crux. Most of the problem you have is in growing oak trees straight. So the people, the local forest estate managers around here spend all their life trying to grow lovely straight oak trees, and they're constantly being thwarted by things like grey squirrels, by deer, by other trees falling over. So there's a constant range of challenges to be met. So in terms of getting non-straight trees, that's not a problem. You've got to remember, when you're harvesting for firewood, you're getting a product every sort of 3 to 7 years. So if you split a wood into 7 parts, say, you're always getting a cash income. Whereas, of course, timber for building would be on a 50 to 100 year rotation. We had Arthur Young, who did a survey in Sussex in the early 1800s. One of the people he interviews talks about the best time to fell oak trees was when they were 50 years old, because you got the optimum amount of growth, but you hadn't tied your capital up for too long. So there's always been this tension between underwood and growing trees for timber.
I always had this idea that people were growing trees for their grandchildren, or great-grandchildren. Perhaps that's just a romantic vision of the past that I have.
I think it's a complex picture.
Yeah. Oh dear. So what else have we got going here? Are tenons always off-centre to the timber, and by how much? Is there a kind of a rule of thumb? Why would this be?
Yeah, that's again a very good question. If I was a joiner making things like windows and doors, the answer would be simple. Tenons are basically 1/3, and they tend to be 5 times as long as they're thick. So there are very strict rules for joinery. In timber frame building, we forget about all that. The tenons are around about anywhere from 1 inch to 1.5 inches thick, and they tend to be offset by about the same amount. So if you've got a 1-inch tenon, it tends to be about 1 inch back from the face. If you've got 1.5 inch tenon, it's about 1.5 inches back from the face. And then the remainder of the other shoulder can either be 0, which we call a bare-faced tenon, or it could be whatever the rest of the size of the timber is. So we're very much what we call face carpentry. We're working from the face, and we often have timbers of different sizes going into each other. So it's not like a window where you tend to have even-sized timbers going into each other. So no, I'm afraid no proportions. The best advice I can give is to go and look at some local timber frame buildings in your area.
Yeah, I imagine it makes a difference whatever sort of wood you're using as well.
To a degree, but infinitesimally, really. Those basic, an elm building would have very similar size tenons to an oak building, and the same with softwood. They tend to be slightly bigger because they're slightly weaker timbers, but not much in it.
Yeah, fantastic. We've got a question here about is it possible to get a list of architectural terms to do with timber framing, particularly to do with the different sorts of tools that you mentioned? There seem to be some quite exotic ones there.
In terms of tools, in terms of building, let me get that right. You've got the Illustrated Glossary. This is a wonderful book published by the Council for British Archaeology. Nat Alcock, Maurice Barley, Mr. Dixon, and Bob Meeson put that together. So that's again on the internet, available, I'm sure. And then in terms of tools, I can't see my copy right to hand, but it's Mr. Salaman, the Dictionary of Woodworking Tools, an absolute classic. Yeah,
well done. And thank you.
That was reprinted fairly recently in a softback, so that's more affordable.
Wonderful. Just before we go, how much time do you spend repairing old buildings, and how much time are you able to spend building new timber frame buildings?
You know what? If only I had a crystal ball, because what happens is that it tends to go. I do a repair, then I do a new build, then I do a repair. But you can never tell. I've had quite a good run of conservation recently, but who knows? It might be 3 new builds in a row.
Do you like doing new ones or old ones?
I love the alternation, because I'm able to put into practice some of the ideas hypotheses I've thought about from looking at old buildings. Then I can try them out, and then I want to see some other old buildings so I can learn some more.
Yeah,
so it's really nice.
I imagine you learn a lot as you're going on. So
yes, always learning.
More questions coming in. They're coming in thick and fast now. It's interesting. It always takes people a while to get going. How did the same jointing methods get to be used around the country in medieval times, and how were they communicated from area to area?
This is one of the great questions that vernacular architecture has sort of thrown up. This how this transmission of information in a sort of pre-printed page, pre-social media age. People must have spoken to each other. I mean, I suppose, you if you collaborate on a building project, you take those ideas and then you disseminate them. And I suppose, we have this concept of 6 degrees of separation now for any individual to any other individual in the world. So I don't think it's that hard to conceive of how information, valuable, if you like, information was transmitted. It would have been from the ale house. It would have been on the framing ground.
Yeah, I always think people communicated much more than because even though they didn't have telephones and email, I'm sure they found ways of communicating.
I agree, exactly.
Yeah. How is the stock of oak doing in Britain now?
I'm an optimist. My glass is half full. I think we've got by and large, some good forestry managers. I think that the value of the crop is being appreciated. Most of the timber frame buildings, actually, you're seeing this renaissance that we've had this in terms of new buildings, is it was all European oak coming from all over Europe. But we can supply English oak is very good, and I don't perceive an inherent shortage. It's been one of these sort of things that has been hanging over. It's always been a perceived shortage of oak, but I'm not worried. I don't go to sleep at night worrying.
No, just go and plant more oak trees. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. One more question here. Do you always, when you're making timber frame buildings, do you use traditional tools or do you use modern tools?
But a lot of people call me a purist because they think I'm always using all these hand tools, but I say I'm a pragmatist. I do have things that I plug into the wall and things like chain mortises and stuff. But by and large, because these timbers are irregular and they're not straight and they're crooked, power tools generally like things very even and square. And so you can use power tools, but I find the hand tools actually are very pragmatic. They do a great job. You can cut exactly to the line and you can work very efficiently. So yeah. I'm a big fan of them, but I'm a big fan not because they're old, but because they work very well.
Yeah, I imagine they give a bit of extra character to the building as well.
Yes, you can see the difference because with power tools, people tend to use better and better grades of timber, straighter and straighter, cleaner and cleaner, and you end up with something that looks like a rather a long way from this essence of using local timber with bits of bark on.
And one last question before we go, because there's been so many of them. Up to what point, in your opinion, is oak workable after felling with traditional methods? And I imagine that's a sort of a question of time, really, isn't it?
Well, we had in the southeast of England, we had a big hurricane in 1987, and I was still using hurricane-blown trees in the mid-1990s. So if you can keep the bark on, the tree effectively stays wet, and so that timber was usable 7-8 years later. Once it's sawn, we reckon it takes 1 year for every 25 millimeters or every inch. Now you can still work dry oak, but the problem is as the oak dries, it gets harder and you get splits, and those splits always tend to be just where you want to mark your line. So
yeah, work it green.
Yes,
it makes you realise. It makes you realise how long it takes for a tree to rot away, then, doesn't it? If it's still workable after all that time. Yes, but some people like to say you should work it straight away. Some people 6 months. Some people, it's very subjective. For me, the fresher the better. Fantastic. That's really good. All right. Well, I think that's about it now. Got various bits of messages coming through. People would like to have a document that confirms attendance at the seminar. I don't know whether we can manage to do that, but we'll do our best. All right. Well, thank you very much, Joe. That was absolutely brilliant and most enjoyable. Thank you, Lizzie. That's all right. We hope we can do it again, perhaps another time. Thank you very much, all the people, for coming and watching today. We've got some more webinars coming up at SANHS on Saturday, the 26th of June at 2 o'clock. A man called Michael Batt will be talking about Bridgewater tiles. and in particular the commercial and cultural relationships between Brittany and the towns on the Bristol Channel during the 19th century. So if you're interested in the trade of Bridgewater tiles between Britain and the continent, that might be very interesting indeed. And on the 10th of July, which is also a Saturday, we have a natural history talk by Nigel Phillip on the Somerset coast. And that will be about the natural history aspects of the Somerset coast. And both of these sound as though they're going to be very interesting. In order to find out about these lectures, you'll need to go onto the SANHS website. That's the Somerset Archaeological and Natural History Society website, and look under events. And don't forget, if you'd like to donate to SANHS today, there's a link on the SANHS donate button under chat, or go again to the SANHS website and look under donations. We have a lovely big red donations button on there now. So that only leaves me to thank Joe, and of course the webinar team who are all working behind the scenes and you can't see them. That is Nathanael, Tony and Harriet. And of course, thank you for all coming along. It's been a real pleasure. Hopefully we'll see you again at another SANHS lecture. Bye.